You are mothering and feeding, we hours of the night. Your gentle love is patient. You'll never fade or tire. Your peace will make us one. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Your peace will make us one.
Welcome, everyone, to the first workshop of the Collaborators Conference. We're so glad to have you here. Today's workshop is presented by James Allison, and it's titled Toward a Girardian Reading of the Book of Revelation. And so just to outline the format of today's experience, James is going to be presenting his workshop to us. After which we'll take a short few-minute break. I'll pause the screen and play some music, and you can take that time to drop your questions into the Q&A box. You can find that at the bottom of your screen. And then we'll come back for a Q&A session moderated by me. And so if you have any technical questions about Zoom or the experience, you can use the chat function to message me, and I can assist you with that. But yeah, I think that covers everything, and we can go ahead and get started. So James, the time is now yours.
Unmute. Is that right? Are we live and well? Excellent. Well, first of all, thank you very, very much indeed for hosting me and for allowing me to take part in this wonderful Collaborators Conference, which you've organized. I'm thrilled to be sharing with you a bit more about the Book of Revelation, because I spent quite a lot of time working on it over the last few years, precisely because it's such a controversial book in that it's so easy to read it as, if you like, the ultimate Christian justification for violence of various different sorts, because it seems to be showing God being very violent. And we know how this has been used over the centuries in a variety of justifying ways. And what I think that Girard's understanding does is it enables us to bring out something which is now coming into ever clearer focus, thanks to the work of Margaret Barker, a wonderful Old Testament scholar, who has recovered the temple imagination, what I refer to the way in which the first temple, and then by imitation the second temple, functioned, and what the priests and visionaries who were in it thought they were doing. Why is this important? Because at the absolute center of the Book of Revelation, there is a temple vision. And it's not only a temple vision, it's the temple vision. Let me say what I mean. I'm going to share my screen a little and show you some text here. Here we have Revelations 4:1, Revelation 4 and 5. This is after the letters to the churches. This is where the vision opens up. This is the central vision. He looked, and there's in heaven, a door stood open. If you follow my cursor, that's roughly where I am. And the first voice, which I heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, "Come up here, I will show you must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit, and there in heaven stood a throne. Okay, this is a throne vision. The throne vision, the first of the throne visions we have, is in the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 6, where the prophet sees the Lord high and lifted up, and above him stood the seraphim. With twain they covered his wings, with twain he covered his feet, and with twain they flied, and they cried one to another and said, Holy, holy, holy. So that's the first time we have this astounding vision of the enthroned one in heaven. With Ezekiel, the same vision gets richer, deeper, more complex. There's a whole lot of colors added. There's a great deal of movement with the throne, and indeed there is a figure in the middle of it who appears to be human, which is really quite shocking that the prophet should have seen in his throne vision, a throne vision in the holy place in the temple, should have seen a human one. And then the same thing it comes out rather more briefly in the prophet Daniel, where likewise there is a son of man, one like a son of man, who is before the throne. But this was understood to be something that was in the holy place, so a real sign of a real vision of what God was really like, entirely outside, beyond, before all time and all matter. Because that was understood evidently that God is not part of created reality. Created reality flows from God, comes from God, not the other way around. And therefore that any vision of God is automatically going to be somewhat confusing, precisely because as humans we can only understand anything to do with matter and time. But obviously for God there is neither before nor after, nor a limited present, with the result that always all of these visions have a sense of the timelessness. Here we have holy, holy, if you follow my cursor, holy, holy, the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. In other words, this is not saying he's been around for an awfully long time. This is a way of saying all of those forms, past, present, and future, are together. They're held together in God. This is entirely outside our ken. What is really interesting in this vision is that, of course, this is the God of Israel. The God of Israel has been worshipped like this for centuries, ever since the temple and the people of Israel have worshipped the Holy One, thanks to through the cult of the temple and the priests. And we can tell that this is being referred to because there are 24 elders falling before the one who is seated on the throne. And King Solomon, in the Book of Chronicles, had set up 24 courses of priests, 24, if you like, groups, clubs, family groups of priests who would take their turn to keep the temple cult going so that there would always be people worshipping the Most High the whole time. So here we have the worship of Israel, the same worship that we're about to see becoming enriched by the presence of the Lamb. And this is what we're now seeing. So the worship of Israel is becoming, if you like, densified. It's being made dense because the seer has seen a scroll with 7 seals, the seals sort of perfection. It's the bounding, it's the word that binds with perfection. And the mighty angel proclaims, who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals? And no one was able to open the scroll or to look into it. In other words, this was something that humans could not understand. And I began to weep bitterly because no one was found to worthy. Then one of the elders said to me, do not weep. See, the Lion, the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. Please notice that the elder is not saying to John, someone is going to conquer. He's saying someone has conquered. He's saying this is something that has happened. Please remember that in this vision, the past, the present, and the future in heaven are entirely simultaneous. So then the seer sees between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders a lamb standing as if it had been slaughtered, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. These are the forms of radiance, the forms of perfection. 7 radiances, the 7 horns, and the word for horn and radiance is the same. And the 7 eyes, the Spirit of God coming out, not only seeing, but bringing light into all the earth. And he went and took the scroll from the right hand of the one who was seated on the throne. In other words, the interpretative word is going to be opened up. When he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell before the Lamb. Okay, so they've now realized that the Lamb is the same as the Most High. Each holding a hat because they're worshipping, which would, of course, they absolutely couldn't if it were not also, if the Lamb were also not God. So now they fall before the Lamb and they sing a new song. You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slaughtered, and by your blood you ransomed for God. In other words, the historical events lived out by Jesus are here understood to have been something that happened before creation, something that was already available in the past from the human perspective. From the divine perspective, of course, past, present, and future are indifferent. There's this perpetual vivaciousness of God, which is far greater than anything to which we have access in our mode of presence, which is by past, by present, and by future. There is something that had already happened, which has come into historical reality. And so then in Revelation verse 5, he hears the voice of many angels surrounding the throne and living creatures. And they numbered myriads and myriads and thousands of thousands. And so we're now getting beyond Israel. Now we're getting from absolutely the whole of humanity, people amongst everyone in the human race, taken far beyond Israel, are being able to recognize and see what has happened. Worthy is the Lamb that was slaughtered to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might. And the 4 living creatures said, Amen, and the elders fell down and worshipped. In other words, so here is the absolute central vision of the book of Revelation, around which literally everything else depends. And this is the achieved rite of atonement. This understands that the Most High has come in the person of his Son, who has identified with the Lamb, given himself in the way that the act of atonement sacrificed a lamb, and that it's in doing this that the Lamb has enabled the whole of creation to be opened up again, and all those who have washed as we will see soon, have washed their robes white in the blood of the Lamb, are going to be ones who are living on the inside of this new creation. Now, what I want to point out here is that this is obviously what's absolutely central to understanding of the Christian faith, and it's absolutely central to René Girard's understanding of the difference Christ made. But what I want to bring out here is that this is the same vision as we get in John's Gospel. In John's Gospel, at the very beginning, John, another seer, has already had a heavenly vision in which he knows that one is coming in. And then he sees Jesus and says, here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And the next day, he says, look, here is the Lamb of God. You see, I've pointed out here. In other words, John the Baptist was seeing the same vision of that which was and is to come. And the one who was in the midst was the making present amongst us of the living out of the slaughtered lamb. In other words, Jesus' life and ministry were the achieving on earth, if you like, that which had already been done in heaven. Hence his prayer, hallowed be your name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This is the understanding that what happens on earth is the achieving in the midst of our time of something that has already happened in heaven, beyond narrative, because beyond our normal functions of time and color and movement. And then at the very end of John's Gospel, when you get the disciples frightened in a locked room which is a kind of inverted Holy of Holies, then the Lord appears in their midst and shows them their wounds. In other words, it's the Lamb standing as one slain. This is the definitive version. This is the definitive vision in Christianity, the definitive apotheosis. And what is it? It's an ever-increasingly dense and rich picture of the throne vision, which was seen only by very great prophets of old and has finally become available to all of us. This is the vision. This is what we celebrate every time we celebrate a Eucharist. We are celebrating the Lamb standing as one slain, giving himself to us, giving us the fruit of his self-giving up to death and turning us into livers of his life, into washers of our robes white with the blood of the Lamb. But this incredible density is of something which has happened. It's been achieved. And that's what I want to bring out. What is it that's been achieved? Well, and this is going to follow on very closely to something that Kevin Miller has been talking with you about, and which I will have the privilege of chatting about with him later tonight, which is that it's to do with the undoing of death. Because this image, the Lamb standing as one slain on the throne, and that being the central vision of God, is an incredibly dynamic image, because it's got two things going on at the same time. The old sacrificial system, the Lamb standing as one slain, being undone so that the Lamb is actually standing. He's undone the sacrificial system and is coming towards us and making it possible for us to take part in the new creation. All that has been achieved. But what it means is that the world and its symbolic system, including every element of its cultural and symbolic system based on death, has been undone from within. This is, if you like, the most astounding dimension of the resurrection. When we read the resurrection text, we are awfully tempted, because we live in a simple narrative structure. Typically, we want a beginning, a middle, and an end. We're inclined to read the story of the resurrection as, well, Jesus had his ministry, he taught people, and he prophesied that he would be killed, and then bad people killed him, and then there was a happy ending. Well, what I'm suggesting, and I think that what the seer is suggesting, is something subtly and more beautifully different. Is saying, well, Jesus came, he had his ministry, he explained that he was going to be put up to death, he explained why he was going to be put up to death. A more or less accidental bunch of people then actually did the deed. And the resurrection was the undoing of death. It was actually not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something. It was okay, that story, the story based on death, is now at an end. I have removed death from the realm of a signifier. From now on, meaning is going to be available other than through death, which is why every sacrificial system is going to collapse, which is why the rulers of the world are going to be shocked and have their ways of running things undone, why the merchants of the world are going to be in amazement, why the temple system in Jerusalem is going to be brought to an end and eventually destroyed. Because death will no longer be the keynote of significance. The cast out one will be the cornerstone. The living one, precisely speaking as a dead lamb who is alive, the dead sacrificed one who is alive, is in fact going to be the beginning of all meaning. And that is what the coming into being of the new creation looks like, when everything that is will actually have the meaning that God wanted for it, with death and all the things associated with death, all its cruelty, all its shame, undone. Now, we get that a little bit when we look at the Gospels. What's difficult for us to understand is how intensely that was understood by John, the visionary. Because what he is then doing in his visions is beginning to unpack the impact that that discovery of what the fullness of the vision of God was, the impact of that on creation in its futility, the old creation as it was passing away. So what you get from this vision onwards, from the vision which I've shown you in Revelation 5 onwards, is ways in which elements of that vision, if you like, flashes from it, start to impact and enable people to understand what's going on in different parts of history. And the parts of history concerned stretch back from the different periods of persecution that the Hebrew people, the people of Israel, underwent at the hands of the Greeks, the hands of Parthians, the hands of Assyrians and Babylonians, and in more recent times, Romans. It's working all the way through that with a different number of images of beasts and dragons, each of which refers to imperial power of different types, but concentrating finally in the destruction of Jerusalem. For the great whore, the whore of Babylon, isn't in the first instance Rome. It gets interpreted much later as Rome. In the first instance, it's the second temple, it's Herod's temple. It's which was considered a very, very violently overtaxing and corrupt operation, which people at the time were scandalized by, as well as terrified of. So it was, if you like, everything that René talks about the ambivalence of the violent sacred that is associated with that temple. Its prophecy, its destruction had long been prophesied. Jesus prophesied it. It was going to happen. It happened. And what you have in the remaining chapters of Revelation, between basically chapters 5 and chapter 19, are different flashes of insight as to how the terribly, terribly violent things that are going on are signs that none of that has anything to do with God. This is the most bizarre claim that I'm making, because the recognition, which is what you have with this Lamb vision, the recognition that it has been achieved, it is done. In John you have tetelestai, it is consummated, it is fulfilled, and then later in the book of Revelation, it is done. That's the whole point. This is all over. God's self-giving into the midst of humans so as to ransom. This is all over. There is no violence in God. What you have instead is the world of meaning that very much associated violence with God being undone little bit by little bit. So it describes, for instance, 7 angels with the 7 cups of the wrath of God, exhausting God's wrath, which is a narrative way of saying there is no wrath in God. And it's only by tiny little bits of peeling away of meaning that you get to realize that when you come to see that God's wrath has been exhausted. There is no wrath in God. It's all over. What God does is bring in the new creation. All the violence that's left is the self-frustrated, non-transcendent violence of humans. In other words, not only was John looking at and referring to the period of time between Jesus' death and the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, but he was also understanding how throughout that period, the consequences of what had happened in Jesus' death on the cross, if you like, the bringing suddenly to life and into our midst of a completely new resignification of everything in a way not run by death, is undoing all fake accounts of sacred violence and is opening up what is going to be the new heaven, where the new Jerusalem will come in. And the new Jerusalem looks like a perfect cube. In fact, it looks like the inside of the Holy of Holies, because there's no temple there. There's no need for a sacred cult. Everything has become the inside of the temple, so that actually our being alive is being taken back to the garden and what it is to actually be created. And there will be no need for light, because all will be lightened by the light of the Lamb. In other words, the source of meaning, that is, he who has undone death and all possible sources of meaning that flow from death, which is absolutely at the center of René's understanding of how the scapegoating mechanism is related to the founding of society, and how the undoing of that is the bringing of the utter aliveness of God into the possibility of human meaning, and therefore living, and therefore history. Well, very quickly, I promised to, in my offer, to just bring out something about how this is, we're facing this at the time of COVID. And if I can, I'd just like to point out to this, what I've noticed as COVID has come upon us, that there are precisely the two ways of reading what's going on that we see in the book of Revelation. What I call the binary way, which is the looking at everything in oppositional terms, good, bad, God, humans, pure, impure, light, darkness, and so on and so forth, which is the reading which encourages the violent reading of this, saying, yes, God has achieved triumph and now is exercising violence on people. That's what I call the binary reading. And the binary reading on COVID is very easily available to us. It's a plot, it's a conspiracy, it's brought from China deliberately, it's a hoax, it causes us fear, it drives us into hiding. Any number of ways of trying to create binary meaning, oppositional meaning out of what is happening. We're aware of that. It goes on around us, going on around us constantly. And of course, all of that is hooked into death and its fear. And then at the same time, what I call the ternary meaning, the Trinitarian meaning, if you like. That all of that is, if you like, the squabbles of futility, because what's really going on is in the midst of all this human collapse, in the midst of all this human acting out in futility, there are the signs of the being brought into being of the new creation, because God has nothing to do with violence. And we're beginning to see elements of our futility. We're beginning to see what we need to do to start to be resilient, to start to create safe spaces for each other, how we can act in ways that bind up and edify rather than grab at meaning and tear each other down. The ternary meaning, the meaning that presupposes that time has come to an end. It is all over. Now all that there is the wagging around for a time of the tail of an evil one who no longer has any transcendence, while we learn how to wash our robes white in the blood of the Lamb. So that's the very brief, apologies for it being so rushed, attempt to fill out with you some Girardian notes. And I'll now stop my sharing and get back to you and ask Joe to give us some music and a quick break so that any who would like to chat or share can do so. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, James. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to screen share and play some music. And for the next few minutes, please take the time to open up the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and drop any questions you may have for James. After the few minutes are up, we'll be back and we'll start a little Q&A. So thanks, everyone.
In the beauty of the lilies, you were born across the sea. With glory in your bosom that is still transfiguring, dismantling our empires till each one of us is free. Your peace will make us one. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Your peace will make us one. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Your peace will make us one.
Awesome. All right. It looks like we have a few questions in our chat, and just to let you know, everyone who's watching, if there's a question that's in the Q&A that you would like to see answered, you can actually go in and you can give it a little thumbs up. You can upvote the questions you'd like to see us go through. So. Perfect. Awesome. James, you ready? Oh, you're still muted. Let me unmute you. There you go.
I consider myself unmuted. Yes, unleashed. Good. Well, what would you like me to? Would you like me to look at the question and answers, or what would you like me to do?
You can open up the Q&A box if you'd like, but I can just go ahead and I can field the questions for you and relay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. You do that. That's probably
awesome. So the first question we have is from Beth. And she says, "Hi, James. Thanks for introducing me to Embarker." She says that the lady, i.e. Sophia, was exiled from the temple first. Could you speak about the lady returning?
Yes. Well, not enough, but the return of wisdom, and because it's Sophia, the lady, the return of wisdom. There's clearly something going on about that in the Book of Revelation with the figure of the woman who gave birth to the child and then is chased away and comes back and then protects those who bear testimony to Christ. And of course, many people have since the earliest times interpreted the Virgin Mary to be this person, and obviously the link between the Virgin Mary and the Great Lady and the figure of wisdom is clearly, it's absolute, there's an absolute continuity there. So I think, as it happens, Margaret Barker, I know she's working on, she has a book about this, about the lady, and she's hard at work on the second volume of that, even as we speak, since she shared a couple of pre-proof chapters with me, I'm proud to say. Boasts of my friends. more will be coming that way from Margaret Barker soon. Incidentally, for the purpose of the Book of Revelation, the text of hers, which I would recommend, is simply her commentary on the Book of Revelation, which is easily the best I know. And it's the one which fills us in on the background, to the temple background, to the visions, and therefore makes vastly more sense of the symbolism than I had been able to understand before. And once you read that with some familiarity with the thought of René Girard, you do see how completely these two fit together, enabling an understanding of the living one and how the living one comes to us.
Awesome. All right. Here's a question from Lisa Green. She says, I love the alternative of Trinitarian thinking of binary. I'm not sure I caught the other word you were using for it. Can you say more about what it means? What makes it Trinitarian?
The ternary. The term I used was ternary, which is just it's like the form of three for binary, so binary, ternary. Look at it this way: for most of us, thinking is oppositional: good, bad, this, that, in, out, etc., etc., and we define ourselves oppositionally. But what I call ternary thinking, Trinitarian thinking, which I think is absolutely vital for understanding the Hebrew religion and the Christian development within the Hebrew religion, is that the understanding of the creation, the Creator coming in and bringing into being, it's always an apparently invisible third that is in fact holding up and bringing into being everything that is, including all those binaries. But because it's, if you like, it's the forest growing rather than any of the trees, we don't tend to see it or perceive it. The flashy things we notice, those are binary. The slow, quiet bringing into being by the Creator, it's very difficult to perceive that, which is why Jesus says that you'll perceive it in the signs of the handing over of the Son of Man. It's in his giving of himself away at different times. But that requires a very special sort of knowledge, a very special sort of perception, seeing the signs of what's coming into being in the handing over, the different forms of handing over of the Son of Man. So, yeah, ternary, it means two quite different things are going on at quite different dimensions, if you like. A surface noise, which is brutal and binary, and the gentleness and mercy of the Creator bringing something into being in the midst of all that, and even trying to rescue the brutal noise from within by transforming it. But much more difficult to perceive by those of us who are caught up in the brutal noise. I hope that's what I was trying to say with making the difference between binary and ternary.
I think that clarifies it really well. We have a question from James Ward. I'm interested in the mechanics of the undoing of death from within, because I think that dynamic continues in all our encounters with false transcendence. Are there traces in Revelation of the shape of that undoing that can illustrate our continuing challenge?
Yeah, well, I think the whole of the Book of Revelation is that continuing challenge, which is why the images of the Book of Revelation can be so very alive to us. Just think of the ways in which the various forms, the 7 cups of wrath, for instance, are the bringing to an end of the promises of punishment at the end of the Book of Leviticus. So there you're seeing very precisely quite a violent, if you read the last chapters of Leviticus, it's pretty violent stuff, the punishments that are threatened. And what you're seeing is those punishments being brought to an end and perfection becoming alive in their midst. So yes, that's a biblical way of undoing that. But if I may, I'd like to bring to your attention, actually to everyone's attention, a brilliant book which is about to be published by our friend Tony Bartlett. It's coming out from Whitford and it's called Theology Beyond Metaphysics. And he brings out more clearly than anyone I know this undoing from within of the symbolic world of death by means of Jesus's undoing from within the sacrificial system. He explains it more clearly, more simply, more brilliantly than I've seen it done anywhere else. And for me, reading the Book of Revelation alongside his book is not specifically about the Book of Revelation, but reading it alongside his book really does bring out how we actually find ourselves in the task of refusing meaning to death in our midst, little bit by little bit, as we go along, trying to live lives that bear witness in the midst of all these fake binaries that are around us.
Awesome. At the top of our Q&A, we have a question from Lee Cheek. And
hello, Lee.
She asked, James, in the language Kevin used last night, is this post any kind of construction?
I mean, it's, if you like, what I consider it, because it's the bringing in of the new creation. It's the way in which something entirely new is emerging, and as it emerges, the deconstruction is falling away. If you like, I think that Kevin talks about deconstruction. We're talking about deconstruction. What we're talking about is the beginning of something, of coming in, and as it comes into being, it positively reveals the futility and the fadedness of what seemed to be something strong and powerful and important, and is in fact fading. So it's a very particular form of deconstruction, because it's the new creation revealing the futility of that which is fading away. So I hope I'm on the same page as Kevin was, but I'm much less canny than he, and much less aware of the world of DC Marvel comics. So I've got less good storylines to be able to explain things by.
We have a question from Deborah Holden. In your words, the wagging of the tail of the evil one is what we are left with until we come to a new way of living together. The wagging is awfully violent currently, and creating so much chaos. How does one live rather than react? Yeah.
Well, but I think the first thing to remember, I talk about the wagging of the tail, and this is not a dog wagging its tail. The image I have is of a lizard. If you have a lizard, if you grab it by the tail will break off from the lizard. The lizard will run away and be perfectly alive with its stump. But the tail will carry on wagging. The nerve ends carry on, it carries on, although it's dead, it carries on. So that's why they use the image of the wagging of the tail. Yes, this is what the Book of Revelation says, the dragon has been cast down, or in St. Luke's Gospel, because it's the same vision, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. In other words, there is no longer any transcendence to evil. It's trying to pretend that it's wagging around, it's trying to play false games. As you say, it's terribly violent, meaning its capacity to trigger great violence in us is still very great. And yet, in the midst of this, we are learning things that are coming into being, that are signs of God's grace and God's forgiveness. For me, in the midst of all this that we're living through now, what I call the 1619 hermeneutic is going to make possible penitence. Actual, not just self-righteous legal struggles by white people to fight for the rights of black people, which are absolutely necessary. Not merely those, but genuine penitence, sorrow, awareness of quite how much of our splendor, our glory on both sides of the Atlantic is the fruit of the Atlantic slave trade. If you like, it's the softening of hearts. That's the coming of the kingdom. It's the actual presence of forgiveness in our midst being shown by breaking of hearts as we realize quite how much we have been dependent on the fruits and on the marginalization and the treating with contempt of our sisters and brothers who live in our countries as the results of the Atlantic slave trade. there's a huge, to me, there's a huge coming into our midst of this softening of hearts. This is why at the beginning of the gospel it says, repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The repenting is not stop behaving badly. It's allow your hearts to be broken. Have your hearts softened so that you can actually see what is being brought into being in the midst of you. So I think it's something like that. I hope that's, sorry not to go on too long.
That was perfect. Peter Smith, he's asking, since you were kind of rushed for time at the end, can you expand further on how to read this COVID season in the, I think he means ternary way?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I hope that I've just given a little bit more of a hint of that in my answer to the previous question. But it's the things that I'm looking for. What are the quiet things that are coming into being? We're being shown the futility of an awful lot of things that seemed strong. What are the quiet things which are coming into being that we're beginning to see that genuinely humanize us in the midst of all this? How we learn to collaborate with each other, for instance, in making our lives together more resilient, at the same time as people are trying to use divisive tactics to frighten us of each other, scare us, make more room for death and more room for profit, and all the usual things. But for me, I think that, if you like, the futility of our governing classes and their sacrifice of any sense of the good other than how can I make a quick profit off any given situation, which has become so absolutely clear during their response to COVID, rather than, if you like, trying to take an organic care for the whole of our respective states, using what powers were available to them to try and organize resilience. Nope, they refused to do that and immediately sought ways of making profit off the production, of the failed production of medical equipment. It seems to me that we've seen so much more clearly what the failed futility of the world looks like. And therefore, we're at the same time starting to get glimpses of what it actually might be like constructively to live together. And in the midst of this, wonderfully, tragically because of the death of George Floyd, but wonderfully, I think genuinely a growing sense of real sorrow of heart. Not just, if you like, self-righteous point scoring, not just woke ideology, but warming of heart and sorrow, the recognition of quite how much we have depended on appalling treatment of our black sisters and brothers.
We have this submission from Tony Bartlett at the top.
Oh, is he watching? Well, I owe so much to Tony, and I hope that he's appreciated my shout out to him.
He says, thank you, James. I love that it's all done. And there is absolutely no violence in God, and this dramatically new meaning is communicated to us via the Lamb in its gospel. Would you be able to say that just as the Lamb demonstrates what is the eternal truth of God, so the eternal truth of God is also a reflection of the actual events of the Passion. So there is no separation. Eternity and time are the same here?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's exactly the point. And it's one of the reasons why, and I think this is what's shown in Luke's gospel, and I'm going to screw which other one, but particularly in Luke's gospel, with at the moment Jesus dies, the veil of the temple is torn, which means that that which was in the holy place is now visible, in fact, on the cross. The self-giving of God, which happened eternally, if you like, outside time, actually happened, boom, there, which is why you have Jesus between the two fallen angels on the cross, the two seraphim, the two thieves, the good one, the so-called good one, and the so-called bad one, with whom he is going to open up paradise. Today will we be with him in paradise. And thereafter, the two seraphim at the tomb, the two seraphim immediately beside at the ascension, is showing, yes, that eternal reality has become historical, and it's as historical that it's going to be lived out now forever. The history has become part of the life of God, and that the ways in which we wash our robes white in the blood of the Lamb, that's to say, the ways in which we undertake this transformation of meaning that's been made possible by this acted out in our real lives, has eternal consequences. It's alive forever. So yes, Tony, thank you. A vital point. I'm entirely in agreement with you.
All right, we have time just for a few more questions. So if you see one in the queue that you want to see answered, make sure to thumbs it up so it bumps up to the top.
Well, this is a popularity contest.
Right? We have a question from Leo. In your paper, you point to some kind of dynamic, tension between the written word version of Judaism coming from the returned exiles and the liturgical version, of the first version, the first temple. I think I got that right. Can you explain that just a little more, or say a little bit of how that applies to our current experience or situation?
Well, I can, yeah, those are two very different and very tough questions. But I'll go for the first one first. Because we receive the Bible as a book, we tend to imagine that it was first written as a book. It isn't. It's a series of documents written over a long period of time. But, and this is the important thing, before there were texts, there were sanctuaries and rites with stories surrounding them, celebrations, the tales people told, some of which were committed to writing and some were not. It was the destruction of the sanctuaries in the 8th century BC in the Northern Kingdom that was probably what led to the first writing down of these accounts. And that what they were writing down were related to their liturgical ceremonies. In other words, liturgy precedes text. In anthropologies, rite precedes myth, ritual precedes myth, liturgy precedes texts. And that it was as the temple, when the temple was destroyed, and therefore that certain liturgical activities were simply not possible, that you started to get the strongly based textual version of Judaism, which is the one which we now take for granted, especially because they attempted during the period after the exile to set up a new temple, and to some extent, at least, to reset up the temple rites. But that came to a catastrophic end in AD 70. And as you know, rabbinic Judaism, since its foundation in 120, 130, has eschewed the possibility of getting back to the temple, and has instead created domestic rituals with reading. And that's how those texts have kept alive. So, if you like, that's part of the answer of rabbinic Judaism to the shift from liturgy to text and the bringing of the two together. And of course, we do something similar in the relationship between Eucharist and text. We try to keep the temple, which is us, nourished by our access to the presence of the real one giving himself Eucharistically, but always with texts to bring out what he is doing in our midst. I hope that's the beginning of some sort of answer to Leo's question.
All right, I'm going to share two more questions. We have this from Marcus. Your sense of living in a time where the rule of death is finished reminded me of something I heard from a spokesperson for the Extinction Rebellion movement. This civilization is finished. The best we can do now is sow the seeds of our successor civilization. In the time-bound reality of our story of humans on planet Earth, are you endorsing this kind of vision of civilizational collapse with your reading of Revelations?
No, because that seems to be very specifically related to an understanding of time. The Extinction Rebellion, at least I don't know anything about Extinction Rebellion other than what you've quoted, but that seems to be much more like some sort of scorched earth policy. Let's burn the house down and someone else will start it later at some other time. I'm talking very specifically about how we, in the here and now, whatever shape or form of apparent catastrophism seems to be going on, how we here and now are living already the ability to begin to live eternal life now. That's what being baptized means. That's what being a priest means, and all baptized are priests. Priests are people who are able to live on the inside of the Holy of Holies now. In other words, our task is bringing to light the new meaning in the midst of the collapse of the old, not being run by it. It's certainly not engaging in some sort of scorched earth policy like the Russian army fleeing the German army as the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in the Second World War, basically raising everything to the ground so there was nothing left for the Germans to graze on. That's simply being part of the sons of this world. We're talking, as Tony was bringing out, we're talking about how the beginning of the meaning that is life, that does not recognize the meaning created by death, starts to be able to be lived by us arduously here in the midst of time, redeeming the time.
All right, the final question we'll share today is from Marty Reinecke.
Oh, hello, Marty.
Yeah. The focus on realized apocalyptic in the book of Revelation and the call by the text, according to some interpretations, to live in a new creation, notwithstanding the pervasiveness of empires and social political issues, has led some Christians to stand apart from political engagement based on their understanding of what it means to live in the new white clothes, as you describe it. For example, radical Reformation groups such as the Mennonites. How do you think about that interpretation of the book of Revelation when so many Christian groups focus on expressing Christian faith today through political engagement, albeit highly polarized?
Yeah, I think that there's a real tension between those two as we live that now. One of the reasons is we have so little sense of quite how our notions of goodness have been adulterated by our participation in empire. So there is something very, very important about the witness of Mennonite, Amish and such communities in their refusal to be run in as far as possible by the fake goodness of empire. And the reason why I'm concerned always about the political thing, and I'm not a political pacifist, I'm not a political, what's the word, person who just retires from politics altogether, quietist, let's say, not quietist at all. But the reason why I'm very nervous about political participation is precisely because how much of our sense of goodness is tied in with national myths, which allow us a certain sort of cheap goodness and don't allow us to inhabit the shame of being forgiven for all sorts of ways in which we are part of the collapse of the failing world which is about us. So yeah, thank you, Marty. I think that the witness of Anabaptist and Anabaptist style communities is enormously important in reminding us of how fake so many of our goodness, even when we think we're doing good political activism, is. It's a real challenge.
Well, thank you, James. Thank you so much for this thoughtful discussion and for taking all these questions.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. And thanks everyone attending for participating, for the questions. If we didn't get to your questions, I'll be passing them along to the moderator for tonight's panel, so they may get answered there. And if you have any questions that pop up, please feel free to drop them in the Facebook group. That's a great place to submit your questions there. Just want to remind everyone that this webinar has been recorded and the replay will be available for 30 days. So if you want to go back and watch, you are able to do so. And one more thing, we received a few requests to offer the opportunity to continue the conversations after these workshops and after the panels. And so if you go to the Facebook group after this workshop, there will be a link posted there where you can join a Zoom chat to continue the conversation. It won't be a webinar like this where you can only see James and I. It'll be a Zoom meeting where y'all can see each other and interact and engage. And so if that interests you, head over to the Facebook group where you can participate in that. So otherwise, thanks everyone for participating, and we'll see you all later tonight.
Thanks very much. Bye.